Hi there. So today I'm going to be giving you a brief history of the Protestant Reformation. If you think back to the last thing we were talking about, I was saying that there are various factors which lead historians to describe the past 500 years as modernity. What that means is modern nation states. It means the connection of the New World to the old, and I should say globalization of all trade happens in the course of the 16th century. And I was arguing that one of the other major factors is the Protestant Reformation, or I should say, really Reformations, because it not only breaks up Western Christianity into various sects, but it also changes the way people worship, the way they think about God, their relationship to God. And let me start by a small disclaimer that I've made before in this course, but let me add it again, that I have no stake in any side in this argument. And I'm not a Christian, and so I'm not, going to argue that the Protestants were doing the right thing, or the Catholics, or the Radical Reformation, or anything. I don't really have any stake in any of that, and you'll see that I kind of understand the sides that we're arguing, and I understand the faults in all sides as well. So I'm going to try and give you a good objective idea of what happened in the course of the Reformations. And I also think this is a very important topic because in general, I find that people, even those with a religious education, often know a lot about their own denomination, but know very little about others and don't really understand why this whole thing happened, mostly because public schools don't allow this to be taught, right? They're afraid that teachers will proselytize their students and try and convince them of their own ideas or evangelize them or whatever it may be. So this is why I think it's a remarkably, incredibly important part of history is understanding what people believed and what they thought the church should be doing for them. And of course, there are really horrible wars that take place in the 16th and 17th century that are a direct result of these denominational divisions. So you can't do this period without talking about the Reformations. So let's start just with a reminder of what the medieval Catholic Church was like. Remember, most people really, their connection to the church was as a social place, right? All the events in a village or a city would have been taken place in connection to the church. And their understanding of religiosity was really one of things you do rather than things you believe, right? There weren't really written down creeds that you said, I believe X, Y, and Z, and this makes me this particular faith. It was more the, worship of the saints, going on pilgrimages if you were really lucky, saying the Mass, making offerings for the dead so their souls could get out of purgatory earlier. And of course, fasting, I think, is really central to the whole, medieval understanding of religiosity, is that during Lent you don't eat meat and meat products, and the idea is that this doesn't stimulate your libido and you're not inclined to sin, and because it's a period of penitence. And of course, there's a days of fasting all through the calendar, so it's not just those 40 days of Lent. And the other thing is that despite all of this, I would say, to be fair, is most people were actually very enthusiastic about the Catholic Church, or I should just say the Christian Church in the West, in the late Middle Ages, because we see them making these donations, paying to have altars built. There are extraordinarily beautiful churches and architecture in the 14th and 15th century. So it's not like like the church was spiritually bankrupt from within and people were fed up with it and ready to protest. And in fact, to start with, it was really an intellectual movement that launched the protest from the vantage point of what we would call anti-clericalism. And what that means is people who just saw a couple of faults within the church. For example, they didn't like the fact that the Pope was not in Rome. Remember, he was in Avignon and getting rather wealthy and powerful off of that, but there was no Pope in Rome. They also felt that there were abuses within the church such that, in the administration, in that some popes had children. They would give positions in the church to their children, or relatives, which is simony, or they would hold many different positions at once, which is pluralism, meaning that you could be bishop of one place and another place, and obviously you can't do your duties in both of those places. So and what we would call a kind of sinecure, which that means is that someone is given a position in the church basically because they come from a powerful family that gave money, but they don't actually perform any duties. Someone else does it. Someone in the trenches is there in the church acting as a parish priest or as an administrator, and and so they're just collecting money. And of course, the church itself got very wealthy. This is something that I keep trying to stress, is that they had tons and tons of money because people gave money. If you give money to the church, it's considered a good deed. It's a work, right? It's one of those things that gets you into heaven because you are helping the goals of the church by donating money to them. And I should mention, in the connection to that, also monasticism. Many monastic orders became very wealthy because it was a place to put your younger sons or daughters into monasteries or nunneries, and sometimes people left their wealth to these institutions. And so even though many of them, they couldn't have private wealth, they took vows of poverty. In fact, the Franciscans, of course. But the monastery itself, the institution itself, could become fantastically wealthy, build themselves a beautiful church. They could own land. They had, remarkable jewels, and according to the stereotype, they ate very well. Remember the friar and Friar Tuck in Robin Hood? Jolly guy, fought, but he ate a lot and drank a lot. So that was, a stereotype. Certainly in England, that's one stereotype. But the other abuses are a little more pointed. In other words, they're not just these. I wouldn't say the others are venal sins, but people criticized the fact that many clergymen recited the Mass, which is, remember, a sacrament. You have to do it to get saved, to be justified. And they didn't really even know what the words meant. Now, what should strike us as weird is that didn't matter, right? Saying the Mass is itself a good work that will help get souls out of purgatory and into heaven. It doesn't matter if anyone's listening. It doesn't matter if the person saying it understands the words. It's kind of ritually efficacious in that just the act of saying it, and you can say it many times. If you say it 4 times, it's 4 times better than if you say it once. It's not like a sermon, or it's not like something that's communicating to the congregation their values or ethics or anything like that. It's really just a ritual that enacts the miracle of the transformation of the bread into the body of Jesus and the wine into his blood, right? And of course, there's words that go along with it, but they're in Latin. And remember, the congregation not only doesn't understand Latin, they might know a little bit, sort of, hoc est corpus meum, they sort of understand this is my body, but in general, they don't know the liturgy. They're not encouraged to read the book, even though it says this is the word, read, this is this is truth, you should read this. It's not in a language that they can understand anymore. It's in, Vulgate Latin, translated back when Jerome did it. And Latin is a learned language for clergymen and physicians and lawyers, but people don't speak it anymore. And there aren't books there anyway. There are, the literacy rate is very low. And remember that most people's connection to the church was in the images they saw on the walls. Churches were often painted in the stained glass windows, in those beautiful elongated Gothic statues, in the altar pieces that they were, was the center of worship. And but remember, they weren't otherwise engaged in the ritual aspect. In other words, in England, for example, there'd be a rood screen, a big screen separating the congregation from the altar, and the priest would have his back to the congregation. And they're not sitting, they're not comfortable, they're not singing along. They're standing there, often on a dirt floor, watching this miracle go on in the distance. And not really participating in it much. And remember, the things that they did participate in would have been rites of passage, like birth, baptisms and marriage, and unction for the dead, and ordination, of course, if you were becoming a priest. Those are all sacraments also. But not really a profession of faith. Okay, that's different. They were things that people did. To get back to these complaints, though, in the church, there were all not just complaints against clerical ignorance, against simony and pluralism, but also, some priests kept women, they were for all practical purposes married. And there you could argue that, it's very difficult to be celibate, obviously. We're not hardwired biologically to do that, but some people kept concubines, or they visited prostitutes, or they did whatever. So that seems to obviously go against the vows that a clergyman would make. And and the other thing that I'll come back to this point because it's really central to the whole reason the Protestant Reformation occurs, is that there are many texts in the Bible, for those who are theologians, obviously, reading it, that said that the only thing that really gets you into heaven is faith, right? This is all Paul, and the works are not bad. They're actually very good. They help the community, and in fact there are other places in the Bible, in James, where it says the good works, faith without works is like a tree without fruit. It's fruitless. That you need those things, and you need both of them. So it's the internal contradictions in the text itself that lead to some of these disagreements. But the point I want to make is that there is a lot of anti-clerical sentiment preceding the Reformation, in the whole century before, in fact, and some things that look rather like what will happen in the Reformation. For example, John Wycliffe, the English reformer, proto-reformer, I should say, thought that the Bible should be in English and that people should read it. And he says things which sort of look like the idea that people should, that faith is what really gets you into heaven, and it's the forgiveness of God, not anything you can do to merit salvation, because of course we're humans, we can't really earn it in a way. But that's the way medieval people thought, right? Is you get a certain number of good deeds and works, and then you have a number. You have, at some point you reach a level where you'll get into heaven, or your time in purgatory will be less. So Wycliffe was one. He escaped being killed, though he was actually exhumed and burned after his death. His followers, the Lollards, were persecuted, and most people who expressed ideas like that were persecuted, sometimes actually being burnt at the stake as heretics. Jan Hus is a very good example from Bohemia, who said ideas that are very much like Luther's, and they ordered him to come to the Council of Constance in 1415, and did burn him there. So we'll see what makes the Reformation different. A couple of very important factors that we've talked about in class already, but I think the printing press is absolutely essential to this as a mass movement, as a movement that gets through by means of communication. That's key to the whole story. I think also the power of temporal prelates, meaning in this case the Elector of Saxony, who has enough power to kind of protect Luther. This is something Jan Hus didn't have. There were no nation states really to speak of, and if the Pope had enough power that he could order you there, and there was no one to protect you and say, I'm not letting this guy go to Rome because he'll only be burned. So I think the power of states is sort of built into this whole thing. And then I think also we have to keep in mind that the 16th century is a period of great social and political unrest that really stemmed from a growing population. Remember, there was that long population dip in the wake of the Black Plague. Well, when we get to the 16th century, the population starts to rise again, and it means the poor people start getting poorer. Their real wages go down. And if you're an investor and selling to people, you have a bigger market. Of course, you're going to do better. Landowners do better, and manufacturers and traders and all sorts of people who are entrepreneurs and investment. And you could argue, I'll come back to this in another time, that capitalism is really born right here when there's a mass of cheap labor to exploit, and people will amass capital and put it into industries. That's sort of what happens. So all of those are factors, the starving peasants, the printing press reaching them and other people, and of course, many other factors go into it, and the power of the state to protect and potential reformers. So those are the proto kind of reformers, and I should include in here Desiderius Erasmus, who we've spoken about as a Christian humanist, was a very, very popular writer, brought to people's attention the abuses of the church, and remember, he did that translation of the New Testament into a new, that was a much better translation, you could argue. But through his colloquies and through the writings he did in praise of folly especially, he brought to people's attention these abuses of the church. And I should mention that, people often say the ideas of Erasmus kind of influenced Luther directly, but Erasmus never broke away from the church, and you will see that was the thing that they disagreed about most. And could not reconcile in the end. Erasmus was trying to reform, not to improve, not break away permanently. So what triggered Martin Luther and what made him very different from these preceding movements is primarily, well, let me describe Luther himself, okay, and just sort of give you an idea of who he was, because I don't think people have a general good sense of that. Is he was an Augustinian monk, okay, in Wittenberg, and not a very good monk either, meaning that he tried very hard to fast and, do acts of penance. He, believed in all the things, the works that you're supposed to do. And remember, monks, they have to wake up in the middle of the night and pray. They have to fast for long hours. They have to be celibate. They, have a really hard life. And it's difficult. And I think what happened to Luther is he was once reading this text in Paul, where it said that the only thing that gets you into heaven, the only thing that justifies you, makes you right, is your faith. And that it's actually nothing you do on your own, because we're kind of unworthy as lowly human beings. But if we have this faith, we are forgiven anyway, despite the fact that we always do bad things. And I think Luther felt, he messed up a whole lot as a monk, and that what gave him a sense of freedom, or like sort of relieved the anxiety, because he really didn't know, like, how many of these good works do I need to do until I can get into heaven? I keep trying and I keep messing up, and it's just not going to happen. And you can see it like gave him this deep spiritual crisis. And he was reading in Paul where it said very clearly, it's not the things you do. There's no book of brownie points that God is adding up to get you into heaven. It's actually the faith. And then he forgives you despite the fact that you can't deserve it. There's nothing we can do to earn our own salvation. We have to, we're not meritorious beings, right? We mess up. Everyone does. And that it's the faith alone. The doctrine is called sola fide, only by faith, are we justified. Now, this, what really triggers this, after this spiritual sort of awakening on his part, is that the Pope at the time, this is Leo X, a Medici Pope, in fact, a fun-loving Pope. He threw great parties. He had great taste in art. He was, in many ways a very interesting ruler. Remember, he's a temporal ruler of central Italy, but not really a person who you would say is a great spiritual leader. Okay, and in fact, I should say the papacy on the eve of the Reformation, there were some rather suspect popes. Let's put it plainly, right? The Borgias, Cesare Borgia, Alexander VI, had children. Cesare Borgia tried to carve out a kingdom for himself in central Italy. His daughter Lucrezia was suspected of poisoning husband after husband to gather together their territories. Don't know if that's true, but it's, this is people's perception. There was one Pope, Julius II, who carried a sword into battle, okay? That's someone who's following the Prince of Peace. It should seem really unusual to you. They were temporal rulers, right? And they were trying to carve themselves out a kingdom. And Leo X, benign as he was, had this idea that St. Peter's really needed to be rebuilt. It was falling apart. It was very, very old church, and he wanted to rebuild it as this beautiful basilica. And remember, I showed you the ideas of Bramante to start with, those beautiful domes that they could build now with Euclidean geometry, and Michelangelo, in fact, gets his hands into that project also. But it cost so much money that the church was kind of desperate to raise some right at this time. And they got into the practice, and this is not a novel practice at all. It's been done throughout the Middle Ages, but it's selling an indulgence. Okay, an indulgence is a piece of paper that says the bearer of this piece of paper will get X amount of time out of purgatory, basically based on what you pay, right, for this indulgence. So you're buying it. And the logic behind it is you're actually doing a good deed for the church. You're paying to have its goals fulfilled. In this case, it was building a new church in the Vatican to be the center of Western Christendom. And you look at that building and you think maybe it was worth it in the end. It's pretty magnificent, but it aroused the suspicion of people like Luther. There was one guy, Johannes Tetzel, going through Germany selling these indulgences. And I should say, it's not just indulgences. Also, it's also dispensations from fasting. and the irony is, remember Erasmus, who I just mentioned, bought a dispensation from fasting because he hated fish. Poor Dutchman, he couldn't eat fish. And there's a weird little episode where he's eating out at a friend's house who's a bishop, and the bishop makes him a special meal of chicken for that evening, and Erasmus is mortified. He says, "Oh my God, you went out of your way to do this, and it's technically illegal, even though I have a dispensation, a dispensation that I paid for." The word gets out, and this bishop Zosimus is brought into the court, and a trial is held basically to accuse him of eating chicken during Lent. Remember, this is a criminal offense. So where does this come from? Where am I going to all this? Is that it's not just indulgences; it's also dispensations from fasting, which you can buy. A whole town can buy one. In fact, the town of Rouen, apparently in France, bought one to build this big tower that they call the butter tower, so they could eat butter during Lent. So, anyway. So there's all sorts of various things, but the indulgences are the most notorious of these. And to people like Luther, this meant, wait a minute, that means that someone with a lot of money can buy their way into heaven. If you could just keep buying dozens and dozens of these indulgences, and it means you get out, pass go, collect $200 and the whole 9 yards, which is, seemingly, theoretically, someone even without faith could do it, right? You just have to be wealthy. And how does that jive with the idea that it's harder to get into heaven, harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle? So Luther decides that he's going to question this and many other clerical abuses. And I should say that Luther, by and large, has one message that runs through all his writings. He says them in various different forms, but basically he's saying that the only thing that will get you into heaven, that will get you justified, is faith, not buying indulgences. And where did the Pope ever get this authority they're obviously not in the Bible, they're not in the New Testament at all, anything like that. So he wants to question these and the clerical abuses, the celibacy issue, the pluralism, simony, clerical ignorance, all sorts of other issues get bundled up with this. And he decides that he's going to debate these with his pals in Wittenberg, in the university. And so he kind of makes a list of these things, 95 of them, so there's a lot more that I'm not even mentioning, nails them up to the church door, which is not really as revolutionary as it might sound. It's a message board. It's a place where people used to sort of hang their, a debate will happen today at 5. Come and have fun and talk with me and argue with Luther. Not really a completely unusual thing to happen. Okay, it's sort of like a message board in any university. It was in Latin, of course, so people weren't meant to read. This was meant for the community to argue these points, and could have gotten him in trouble, sure, but probably not. What really got him in trouble is someone took those down, someone copied them, put them in German, published them, and spread them everywhere. And this is at the moment there's sort of social unrest among the peasants in there and throughout Germany. And of course, people are incensed. They look at this and say, wait a minute, the indulgence that I just paid for is not going to get me out of heaven. The altarpiece that I paid for, the pilgrimage that I went on, the holy relics that I went to venerate, this doesn't matter at all. And so they are, of course, incensed, and it's mixed up with their feelings of hatred against landlords, who are often clergymen, right, who own land or monasteries or whatever. And of course, there's money they pay to the church anyway in sort of taxes. And so these things get mixed up. And to make this long story short, Luther is ordered to go to Rome. The Pope says, you get down here and answer to these issues right now. And I think everyone knew he would have been burned had he gone. The Elector of Saxony, Frederick, grabs Luther, says, we're hiding you. You're going to grow a beard. And it's partly because he wanted authority over his region against the power of the emperor. Remember, we're talking about Germany here. It's within the Holy Roman Empire, but each temporal ruler basically has control over their region, in this case Saxony. And he protects Luther and decides on his own volition that he is going to implement this Reformation. So it really, the ideas come from Luther, but this is as they say, a magisterial Reformation, meaning it's put in by magistrates. It's not a grassroots movement. It doesn't swell up from the people. It comes from the state actually imposing it because they wanted their independence and because, the ruler doesn't like paying those taxes to Rome and for various other reasons. And it starts to snowball from there. And eventually, of course, they decide that the Pope should not have the ultimate authority. There was, in fact, a conciliar movement that preceded all of this that I mentioned when we were talking about the Middle Ages that said the ultimate authority in the church should be a council, as it was like for Nicaea and all those other councils in the early church, not the Pope. And the Pope is not infallible, as he claims. He's a person, and he's elected, and by cardinals, and of course he can make mistakes. But how this snowballed is that they decided to reform the church entirely and address those abuses that we mentioned before, so that the most important things, I would say the liturgy in German is absolutely essential, is that suddenly people can participate in the ritual. Luther himself writes hymns. So people are singing along with the liturgy. You probably know some of these. Ein Festburg ist unser Gott. A mighty fortress is our God. He wrote that. Wanted people involved in the whole thing. He decided that churchmen should just be married, right? I mean, there's a place where Jesus actually says, it's better if you don't get married, but he doesn't say, no way, you have to be celibate. And there's a very funny story of Luther and his fellow monks sort of pairing off with nuns, and Luther gets the very last one that no one's chosen. It's like choosing for a baseball team. He gets Catherine von Bora, and they make a lovely couple. You'll have to look at them, and you tell me what you think. But he broke his vows, obviously, and they decided that clerical celibacy was not a very good idea. And the interior of churches begins to change. It becomes more like a big hall where and sermons happen rather than the mass. But I think that the vernacular literature is most important, and of course the doctrine of faith alone. But I think another thing that Luther kind of starts but doesn't really, sort of carry through to its logical progression, is he said if the Bible says something, you should do something. If it's in the scripture itself, this is the doctrine of sola scriptura, by scripture alone, then you should do it, right? I mean, you should follow that. If, there's the whole slew of traditions that are not really in the Bible, fasting being among them. So the Lutheran church, eventually gets rid of the whole idea of public fasting, on specific dates, because it doesn't really say that. The Bible doesn't say that. In fact, it says all food is good, right? And for Germans, remember, that was a burden, I think. They didn't have olive trees for olive oil. They had to buy it from Rome, and, they had plenty of butter all around, and cheese and eggs and things that they could have been eating, but they couldn't. So things really change, but what doesn't change is Luther doesn't carry through that idea that it should be only the Bible that's the guide to faith and practice, church practice. And in fact, with the church government, Luther didn't really care. This is a doctrine called adiaphora in Greek, which basically means, if you want to have bishops, doesn't matter. If you want to have, a certain structure of government and tithes and whatever, this stuff is all good for keeping people in line. And so the church, organization, the administration of the church doesn't actually look that much different than Catholicism. It's just the Pope is taken out. That's the only really big difference. And obviously some German states reform, by and large in the north. Some remain Catholic, and this will be for the next 2 centuries a big reason to fight over it. But let's turn to the next Reformation, because it's slightly different, and it is an entirely different sort of course for the reform. I should say, before I get to that, is that northern Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, those become all the Lutheran countries. Okay. A different path is taken in Switzerland. And let me start there with a figure who you probably haven't heard of. This is in the town of Zurich. Is Ulrich Zwingli. I know it's a wonderful Swiss name, but Zwingli was of the mind that the Bible, we should only do what it says in the Bible itself, this doctrine of sola scriptura, and that if it's not in the Bible, we shouldn't do it. So he's the one who comes out directly and says fasting is it's not a bad idea. In the Old Testament, people fasted all the time whenever they committed horrible sins. Remember David seeing Bathsheba and sending her husband into the front to die? Well, he fasts as a result of that to atone for his sins. In emergencies, in the course of war, even in famines, weirdly enough, the people would fast to avert God's wrath. And Jesus himself fasted. Remember, 40 days in the desert. But this whole idea that fast means not eating meat, its logic is really medical. It's this idea that it's very nutritious, it'll stimulate your libido. It's not in the New Testament. And so Zwingli says that has to go. We can fast as publicly and privately, but not just meat, and not on regular, during Lent, not for particular occasions. But the most important thing that divided, this is called the Reform movement, okay? Even though the whole thing is called Reformations, this is the Reform tradition. Zwingli said, look, the really important thing that we have to think about is what is happening in the Eucharist, in the Mass itself, when that bread is supposedly miraculously transforming from bread into the flesh of Jesus, which, remember, from 1215, from the Lateran Council, they had decided that it was through the doctrine of what's called transubstantiation, that the bread, it still looks like bread, but its actual substance has miraculously changed into flesh, and eating that gives you the spiritual benefits that gives you grace and forgiveness and gets you saved. So it's a good work, but it does really change into flesh. And Zwingli looked at this and he said, come on, folks, look at the Bible closely. Remember, he's also got this legacy of humanism behind him. And Jesus spoke metaphorically all the time. He said, I am the vine. Does that mean he was literally a vine? I am the, so what he's saying is that in the New Testament, in the Last Supper, where he's describing what's happening, he's saying, you guys, you're not paying attention to me. You're not listening. I'm going to be gone tomorrow, and for all you guys care, this bread could be my body, and this wine could be my blood. So the next time you eat and drink, remember me. That's what he said. And he does, of course, literally say, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body. Was it literal? Zwingli says, no, of course not. It's metaphorical. And moreover, he says, and if it were literal, then we're cannibals. We're eating his flesh. There's something really weird about that. And Zwingli, saw, I think, that there was something radically pagan about that too. Remember the Dionysian rites? They drank the wine as the blood of the god. And Zwingli was very careful to remove things that he saw as pagan, that were sort of just accommodated in the course of the early church conversions, things that were not in the Bible at all. And in fact, the followers, I should mention, of Zwingli in the Reformed tradition, got rid of Christmas, because Christmas, it wasn't the Grinch, despite what you think. Christmas was actually, the birthday of Jesus was never mentioned in the New Testament anywhere. And in fact, it's the same day as Saturn, the Roman Saturnalia. So the early reformers kind of worried about this. If we're going to look at the Bible literally and take it word for word, at what we would call fundamentalism, right? Then we can't do things that are just thrown in and by tradition, and not in the text itself. So the Bible doesn't say anything about, this Lenten fasting. Doesn't say anything about the literal flesh of God. It doesn't. So there's a lot of stuff that is not clear in there, that they begin to change. And it also, if you remember, says, thou shalt not bow down before graven images. So they are largely iconoclastic, meaning that they didn't like the idea of crucifixes or images of saints on the walls in the stained glass window, because when people were praying to these as intercessors, remember, you ask a saint for a favor, and he'll intercede with Jesus on your behalf. They were kind of thinking, this is sort of like polytheism, isn't it? And people are really praying to the image. We need to get rid of images and focus on the Word, because the Bible itself says, I am the Word. This is all you need, is this text. You don't need all this other stuff. So they were iconoclastic. They started breaking images, smashing statues, and doing all sorts of things. Now, I should say, Zwingli was not the only one. In Zurich, there was Ecolampadius in Basel. Isn't that a wonderful name? There was Martin Butzer in Strasbourg. There's Vadianus in St. Gall. So there's a whole slew of these people doing the same thing at the same time. Guillaume Farel in Geneva, in the French-speaking part of Geneva. But the person who kind of shapes this Reformed tradition more than anyone is John Calvin. So when I say Calvinist, that's the direction that this whole movement goes, and it becomes a different sect than Lutheranism, a different kind of Reformation. And let me explain why. First of all, Calvin, after various times being kicked out and being invited back in, eventually more or less runs the city of Geneva. Gets control of the city council and says, look, this idea of faith alone is wonderful, but does it make people better? What if I just believe and then go off and keep doing my sins? If I'm forgiven in the end, what does it matter? So Calvin said we have to help people along to be better. We can't just expect them to have faith and have the good works spontaneously flow out of them, as Luther said, is we need to make a moral society. And there are things we need to prevent. We can't let there be prostitution in the city. We can't let the theaters run, because we know that's where all the crime comes out of the popular entertainment. We can't let the taverns stay up all night, because the people will become alcoholics. And I should mention, distilled alcohol is a relatively new thing, and you order a pint of that stuff and you drink it. It's strong and will make people do things they wouldn't otherwise. So Calvin decided to reform the whole city of Geneva, more or less, and decides that the church should not be top down. It shouldn't be, obviously in Lutheran there's no more pope, but there's bishops still making those same decisions. He said every congregation should decide the finer points of its liturgy. They should have presbyters, which just means kind of an elder in Greek, who look after the public morals, and then the pastors should really be elected by the congregation. It should be someone they like, who they trust, not someone appointed by the ruler or by the pope or someone very far away. And so this is more a democratic kind of church government, from the bottom upward. And the presbyters were, of course, morals police, more or less. They were, charged with looking after, making sure everyone was behaving, and you could imagine people saw this as kind of oppressive. But they did take the text of the Bible very literally. Luther also introduced an idea Calvin introduced an idea that was sort of already in Luther, but not carried through to its absolute extreme, is this idea that we don't participate in our own salvation, it's called passive righteousness, that we become good because of the forgiveness that God gives us through grace, but not through any way that we can merit on our own behalf. And what that means, if you think it out logically, and I want to describe, Calvin is a very different kind of thinker than Luther was. Isaiah Berlin, the historian, described Luther as a hedgehog. Keeps coming back to the same topic over and over and over again. Calvin was a fox. He's all over the place. He writes one thing, then he's interested in something else, and a really brilliant thinker in many ways. His institutes of the Christian religion are kind of anthropological. They ask, why do people have this need universally for religious experience? It's a fascinating book. And then he comes out with this idea for the church government. But in the course of his other writings, he's thinking, and I'm simplifying this really radically, but he thinks, look, if God is omniscient, knows everything, beginning and end, regardless of time, he is omnipotent, he can do whatever he wants at all time, that's the definition of God, then he already knows whether we're saved or not, right? He's got the book of life already inscribed. There's no brownie points being collected as you do good works or not. And if faith is the only thing that gets us saved, then this is the doctrine of what's called predestination, meaning that it's already decided whether you're going to heaven or not. Now, of course, we don't know that. But in terms of people thinking, oh gosh, am I saved or not? It often happened, and I think this argument is made a little too strongly, but it often happened that people would say, well, look at me, I'm successful, I'm a good person, I'm righteous, I must be among the saved. I'm going to be among these saints, and after the final judgment. That guy over there who's a drunk lying in the gutter and beating his wife, clearly he's not saved, right? Because look at the way he's sinning. And although the theology never said this, at least it's the idea of people like I'm forgetting his name, the great Swiss historian who invented the idea of the Protestant work ethic, Max Weber, sorry, who said that, that people would tend to look at their material success as a sign of their election and predestination, and therefore that would encourage them to work harder and put their nose to the grindstone. And this whole idea that Protestant countries, they don't spend their money on, extravagances and jewels and fine paintings. In fact, they did, but that this was a religion that really encouraged work. And he made an argument that I disagree with much of what he said, but the argument is made that capitalism and Calvinism go really well together, is that it is a religion that encourages you, rather than decorating the church, to put your money back into your business, to invest it, to make it seem like you're among the elect, right? Although Max Weber never really says that so plainly, but the idea is that that Calvinist countries become the greatest capitalist ones, and to some extent that's true, right? If you look at England and you look at New England. Now, having said all that, I haven't described where Calvinism goes, but I want to introduce one other idea, is that unlike Lutheranism, there was a peasant revolt that immediately followed Luther, and in 1525, and he basically said, the rabble, put them down with violence if you need to, and they did. Calvin, Calvinist Geneva, they do burn heretics. Michael Servetus, really interesting figure who wrote a fascinating book on syrup. No, I'm absolutely serious. He was burned at the stake, the first person in Calvinist Geneva to be burned for heresy. So it's not like these were open-minded people at all. But Calvinism had within it a theory that if you are under the rule of a person who is forcing you to do things that are going to jeopardize your salvation, then you have the right to rebel. Just as Geneva rebelled against its own ruler, the bishop of, I don't remember where it was, but they fought basically for their freedom. Zwingli, incidentally, died in battle. Zurich was trying to gain its independence. But what we'll see is in many, many cases, Calvinism leads people to rebel against their rulers. The Netherlands is a great example of that. Scotland in the war and the English Revolution breaks away because of that, as do the Puritans in England, as do, so this has great political consequence. Read Philip Mornay if you're interested in this. It justifies rebellion for religious purposes, which is really, really interesting. And so, as I've just given you a hint, the countries that join into Calvinism are not just in Switzerland, they are the Netherlands in its revolt against Spain. That's Holland and the northern part of the Netherlands. Scotland and its Presbyterian government. The Huguenots in France. There's a whole slew of French Calvinists. Actually, Calvin was French. And the Puritans in England, who eventually lead to a civil war in the middle of the 17th century. And then, of course, the people who escaped England to go to New England. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was the Puritans, or Pilgrims, whatever you want to call them, were Calvinists also. And the government that they set up there was consciously a moral republic. The city on the hill was supposed to be along these same lines. And that was the religious freedom they were looking for. They weren't being religiously tolerant of other people. They just didn't want to be part of the Church of England with a king. And I should mention, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but England also had its own Reformation, really strange one, because it was not initially a doctrinal Reformation. It was primarily one in which the king, Henry VIII, wanted to annul his marriage to Anne Boleyn, to Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry his girlfriend Anne Boleyn, with whom he gets. She gets pregnant, and they have Elizabeth, down the road. But it starts for political reasons, and then his advisors, Thomas Cromwell, convince him he needs to close down the monasteries and get all their wealth, which he does. And then, Protestant advisors, Cranmer especially, who's probably Lutheran, convinces him that they need a new Book of Common Prayer. So it's a strangely halting Reformation that not only goes really forward after Henry dies under young King Edward, Martin Bucer actually goes to Oxford, the Swiss reformer, to teach there, but one that pulls back immediately after he dies and Queen Mary comes. England becomes Catholic again, goes back under the Pope. The Inquisition is unlocked there. And then when she dies, she only reigns for like 5 or 6 years, I think, something like that. Elizabeth comes and she's Protestant again. So the country goes back and forth and back and forth. And by the time we get to the end of the 16th century, there's actually people who are very conservative. There are a few real Catholics left in England, even though it's technically Protestant. There's no papal authority there. But there's also people who, the hotter sort of Protestant, who want a full reform, who are called Puritans, and they are Calvinists theologically. Okay, so that's how that happens in England. And I'll come back to England in just a moment, because there's another wave of reform thought in the 17th century. But let's follow up with what happens in Europe before then. From the very start of this Reformation, there is a grassroots movement. There are people who are saying, theologians sometimes, but also just ordinary people, that look, if you look closely at the text, if we're going to really look at that text as a model for worship and belief, well, the book, for one, says, if someone slaps you, you turn the other cheek. It's radically pacifist, in fact. The idea of a just war, which we know was, concocted in the course of the Middle Ages to justify the Crusades, to justify burning heretics. Remember St. Thomas and others who kind of figured out, of course, we need to kill people. These people, these radicals, and look at the word radical. When I use that word, I don't mean extreme, although they were extreme, but radical comes from the word radix, means root. They want to go back to the root of primitive Christianity as Jesus actually lived it. So radical and the word radish are actually the same word. I know that's a weird connection, but what they want is to go back to what the text and Jesus says and what Jesus was actually doing. So they are pacifists. They also make a point of saying, and this is where they will get their name, which is why I'm holding out on the name for a moment, that there is no point in the New Testament where an infant is baptized. Baptism is a sign that you are willingly joining into the church and becoming a legitimate member of it. Jesus was an adult when he was baptized, and so are all his followers. And so we should really be baptizing adults as a way that they signify that they're coming into the church. This is why they are called Anabaptists. It means a rebaptizer, because of course all these men were baptized as infants, and to be baptized twice is technically heresy. But they're saying, no, the first time didn't count. We didn't get a choice in that. We were just, the water was sprinkled on us when we were infants. And they want to go back to adult baptism. Anabaptism is not a nice term for these people. And in fact, there are many different people. They're not one concerted movement. But essentially what happens is in Zurich, right under Zwingli's nose, 1525, a handful of men, who is it, Blaurock, Konrad Grebel, and Felix Manz, baptize each other. And that's often called the birthday of Anabaptism. But they also looked at this text more closely, not just the pacifism, not just the idea of adult baptism, but they also said, look, there's no church either. There's no church organization. Anywhere people meet in my name is a church. And there does not need to be an ordained clergy. Imagine if you're, going somewhere, you're out in the middle of nowhere. Does it mean suddenly you're damned because you don't have a clergyman there to administer sacraments to you? So anywhere people gather in my name is a church. You could do it in a house. And their focus will be on looking at the text itself. Okay, reading the Bible. Obviously, you have to be literate. And getting rid of all the other things that were part of standard Christian worship. Not just the physical building, the vestments on the clergymen. And I should say also, that's similar to Calvinist faiths. They were iconoclast, right? But the vestments become very simple. But these are far more biblical literalists in that sense. Sometimes they live in separatist communities. And these people, these Anabaptists, were of course persecuted from the very start. Some of the earlier ones, and this was considered to be kind of ironic, they would put him in chains and throw him in the river, and they were, rebaptized, I guess. It's horrible. Some were burned, some died of plague. I mean the history of the early Anabaptist movement is really horrifyingly awful. And I would say that the movement loses its legitimacy among thinkers when there's a very strange set of events takes place in the city of Munster, when Jan Buchels basically says, "I'm reviving the ancient kingdom of Israel," and remember, Jesus goes around without any property. So he says, "There's private property is abolished. Everyone, open the doors, and I'm going to take many wives," like it said in the Old Testament. And there's that's a really, really strange set of events. People start running naked in Amsterdam to proclaim the truth of God. So this was like a challenge to the structure of society, not just a religious reform, but they actually take over the city of Munster and then start executing the ungodly, and things things really get out of hand, and it takes the bishop getting reinforcements after several years, moving into the city and taking it over by force, and actually putting the body of Jan and his followers in cages on the cathedral and just leaving them there forever. The cages are still there on St. Lambert's. But what that does is it kind of discredits this movement. It survives by moving eastward generally. It goes through various different forms. One group that comes out of these are the Hutterites in Bohemia, who live communally, separate from the abomination. They have separatist communities where they live in common, men and women separate, and they become very industrious. It's a really, really interesting movement. You might know them because they still survive in North and South Dakota and Canada. But the ones that I think are the most interesting of the Anabaptists are the Amish and the Mennonites. The Mennonites are kind of the group of Anabaptists that come closer to Calvinist theology and are not as radically separatist, whereas the Amish, of course, are. And they, later down the road decide that they're going to reject modernity and not use electricity and, wear plain clothes and have but it's a religious group. That's what most people don't quite realize, is that rejection of modernity is a way to keep apart from the corruption of the world. And of course, those people don't survive in Europe. By and large, they live in Pennsylvania and the Midwest, Ohio, and the Amish and Mennonites survive because they're invited by William Penn in the 17th century, much later. So they survive, like the Hutterites, in the United States, where there was, eventually a kind of religious freedom. Pennsylvania, certainly. So as all of this is happening, what does the Catholic Church do? This is right under their noses, and they're trying hard to keep adherence. And I would say the first reaction of the Church is a kind of knee-jerk reaction to persecute heretics, as they did during the Albigensian Crusade, as they did with the Inquisition in Spain and the Roman Inquisition too. And that, by and large, doesn't work. Partly because the reformers are political leaders, or they're protected by political leaders, with the exception of the Anabaptists, of course. And so the Catholic Church, it really takes them another generation to get around to saying, okay, we really do need to reform these abuses. We really need to reinvigorate the church in some way so that we don't lose all of our, all the faithful. And this doesn't really get going until like the 1540s or so, and specifically in the Council of Trent. They decide that we have to hold a council. Trent was way, way, way in the northern part. It's in Italy today. Then it was part of the empire, but it was a place that was sort of in between, on the borders, that they thought no one could control the proceedings. And while they are there, they make some very interesting decisions. First of all, they reaffirm much of what the Catholic Church had been very important to them. So, for example, clerical celibacy is still on the books, the Mass in Latin, the value of relics, the importance not just of faith, but having good works also as something that will get you into heaven, saying Masses for the dead, all those theological things that were the structure of late medieval Christianity, they reaffirm very, very strongly and say, we declare Luther and Calvin to be heretics. I should say, while this is happening, incidentally, the Lutherans and Calvinists try to reconcile themselves. It's largely Philip Melanchthon for the Lutherans and Calvin and other followers. They can't get over this idea of the real presence in the Eucharist. Luther kept it, or at least something called consubstantiation, and the Reformed tradition rejects it entirely. So I should mention that the ferment is everywhere, including in England, in the course of the 1540s. But the Council of Trent reaffirms those things. But I think what really changes the direction of, we can now call it Roman Catholicism, is a new kind of spirit that comes from, let's call it a different kind of evangelism. It's not one that's really simple and plain white churches and plain black frocks. It's exactly the opposite. It's an aesthetic approach to religion, meaning that if we're going to keep souls, we should make the music glorious, polyphonic. We should make the stained glass much better than they had in the Middle Ages. We should use this new architecture that we have. And in fact, it's the late 16th century and eventually the Baroque style of architecture really is I think the perfect expression of this Counter-Reformation. They also decide that much of the art of Catholicism was kind of indecent. To give you a classic example, there's the Last Judgment painted by Michelangelo, right facing the Sistine ceiling, which has a lot of naked figures in it, and Michelangelo even made a naked Jesus, believe it or not. They put a big bronze diaper on him and they painted over all the naughty bits in the Last Judgment, saying there has to be a sense of decorum in the church. We can't let people be looking at lascivious pictures of bosoms and naked bodies while they're in church. And so the mood of church changes from one where remember, people used to bring animals and eat their lunch and didn't understand what was going on, to one where they have to be engaged. And to do that, rather than through the text, they did it through the dazzling theatrics, through the beautiful vestments and music and incense swinging and the stained glass. And it's a very different aesthetic than the Middle Ages, which was sort of introspective and brooding and dark, and the one-line chant. Here it's just glorious. Blow trumpets, let angels sing, and suck people back in through this intense kind of emotion. And I should say, to add to that, is the theology of Saint Teresa of Avila and other mystics, Saint John of the Cross, largely Spanish mystics, who say that the experience of religion should be one that's completely gut-wrenching and emotional, and you should be carried away like you would be by a lover. That's the way, Saint Teresa talks about it, like a burning ravishment. And if you look at the statue of her by Bernini, there's an angel about to plunge a flaming arrow into her heart, and she's there having this suffering, magnificent suffering. Look at that. It's wonderful sculpture. You'll get a sense of why people sort of join in again. They want to be ravished in that same way. And I should say, maybe most important of all of these is a new organization, what's called the Society of Jesus. We know them as the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius Loyola, who gets a religious order that doesn't have to go through all the fasts, staying up in the middle of the night and fasting all the time. They're allowed into the world, and they're allowed to be active in the world. And the way Ignatius organized this new order was like an army. It's a military. There's a general, basically, of the Jesuit order. And he decided that what they were going to focus on is reconverting, or converting in the first place, people through learning. And it's why the Jesuits are still in the business of education, all the Jesuit colleges and schools throughout the country, but also through missionary activities that they went to. They were the first to reach China and Japan. They were the first to start missions. Well, not the only ones, but they started missions in the New World also. And you can see this sort of vibrant energy comes out of this new theological mysticism in Saint Teresa, and this new kind of militarized religiosity with the Jesuits and their missionary activity. Now, having said that, wars break out over this anyway. There's this nasty civil war in France for many years. There's a war of independence in the Netherlands. There's a civil war in England over this, and it's not just Eastern Europe. It's Western Europe. It's Eastern Europe also. There was a kind of Calvinist movement in Hungary that was put down violently, and then when we get to the middle of the 17th century, there's the 30 Years' War, which basically rips Germany apart over the issue of religion, and it changes military strategy entirely, and you could argue leads to modern warfare in some respects. But what it does is, in the long run, is it divides Europe in two. It means that northern Germany and Scandinavia are Lutheran, some of Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scotland, not really England. England is sort of in between somewhere, but they are in the Calvinist tradition, and of course that moves to what will become the United States, or Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the Anabaptists get lost in this shuffle, and end up going there also. But what all of these movements do, is they fundamentally change the nature of religion. That it now becomes something you believe, a creed, a set of things that you say and believe, rather than a set of things you do. And you could argue that in both cases, it's a far more personal relationship with God. It's not just Luther. I think in the Catholic Church also, the introduction of rosaries, greater stress on confession, and of course participation of the congregation. Although it's still Latin, it won't be put into the vernacular until 1964. It was the next time the Vatican II Council meets, and then they change it again. But by and large, Trent sets the tone of Roman Catholicism for the next 400 years. So that's the Reformation, and I did it in almost exactly an hour. But what we're going to talk about after this is I want to make a connection between the birth of the modern nation state. I'll talk about briefly in just a few minutes, and then we will look at, I shouldn't say exploration, let's say the accidental encounter of Europe with the Americas, with Africa, with Asia, and I'll talk about that in class. So, thank you.